Welcome to the fourth and final video in this series on the God of the Old Testament. In this video, we will consider the often quoted passages in the Old Testament where God is said to have instructed Hebrew armies to slaughter every man, woman, and child when conquering their enemies. This sometimes even went to the extreme of slaughtering all the animals owned by their enemies. Surely, these are the most offensively violent and cruel images in the Old Testament, the ones that have caused many people to turn away from such a terrible and apparently unloving God. So, what do I have to say about that? I'm not sure how clearly it has come across in this series, but with each video, I have argued 2 points at the same time. The first being that maybe the traditional God of the Old Testament is actually a distortion of reality. The second approach has been that maybe he has not been distorted. Maybe he does not want us to know some things, as we suggested in the first video in this series, in reference to the tree of knowledge. Maybe he does want us to hate our families, as suggested in the second video about him asking Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac. And maybe he does want us to try to keep every detail of the hundreds of laws that appear in the Old Testament, as I suggested in the third video about Moses and the Torah. So, I'm going to top it off today by, first, considering the possibility that God did tell his people to wipe out every sign of life when conquering a city or country. That is, of course, genocide at its worst. So, this is not my favorite interpretation of what I have often found in the Old Testament, but I do believe that the bottom line is that God has the right to be whatever he wants to be. Each time I hear someone raving about what a God of love is allowed to do, it upsets me, because I know that they got the God of love image from the same Bible that includes the so-called cruel God of the Old Testament as well. And we need to give more thought to how these two views can be reconciled. It should, for example, be noted that this harsh image of God is not limited to the Old Testament either. Jesus had plenty to say about hellfire and a place where there will be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. The Revelation reveals Jesus on a white horse going forth to conquer, including the famous Battle of Armageddon, where he takes on all the armies of mankind and totally destroys them. The coming tribulation is predicted as being a time of greater suffering than has ever happened at any other time in the history of the world. God has literally promised that he will do nothing to stop it, at least until just at the very end, when things only ease off long enough to get his faithful followers, most of whom have already suffered and died as martyrs, off the surface of the earth before he pours out his wrath upon those who remain. So, the negative picture of the God of the Old Testament has never really been limited to the Old Testament. Even the loving Father God of the New Testament believes in discipline and in some kind of shocking punishment for people who reject his love. But there is another way to view this cruel God, and that is what I am going to put forward right now by taking a closer look at the two most honored kings of Israel. I personally believe that the kings and the human leaders of the Old Testament are not the kings of the invisible kingdom of heaven that Jesus preached. Believing that the two are consistent is how the contradictions have arisen. Any distortion in the supposedly godly role of various kings and rulers in the Bible may also extrapolate into distortions with how we understand the nature of God himself. We already know from the previous video that there are disturbing contradictions in the laws of Moses in the Old Testament. The books themselves fail to tell us how most of those laws came into being. The so-called stone tablets, on which the 10 most famous laws were written, no longer exist. And what we do have are 2 different accounts of what was written on those stones. Similar problems exist with regard to the entire so-called Kingdom of Israel. Under David and Solomon, Israel's second and third kings, the nation enjoyed what has been called its golden age. That lasted for about 80 years, and then everything started falling apart. To this day, many conservative Jews think of David as having been their Messiah, their anointed one, even though the so-called golden era tarnished to almost nothing in less than a century. Something we do know from Scripture is that David was a warrior king, and that Solomon inherited the gains that David made through war. But the Bible also says that David was not worthy to build a temple for the one true God precisely because he was such a violent man. Do you see the implications of this fact? The same Old Testament that says David was a reflection of the heart of God decreed that because David was a warrior king, he was not worthy to build a proper temple in which the true God of the Old Testament could live. That must be one of the most puzzling contradictions in the entire Bible. Over and over, we are told that God led David and others into battle, even commanding them to kill everything that moved in doing so. Yet, this other God, the one whom we might compare more with the God of the New Testament, labeled the almost impeccable greatest king ever in Israel as being unfit to build him a temple in which to live. I won't go into the details here, but we have a video called Abraham's Descendant, which explains how the Old Testament also recorded this loving God as having told the Hebrew prophet Samuel that the demand by the leaders of Israel to have a king was an outright rejection of him. The kingdom of Israel was founded on rejection of the true God of the Old Testament. Do you hear what I am saying? The true God of the Old Testament himself is recorded in the Old Testament as condemning much of what is written in the Old Testament as not having come from him. God did not need to wait until Jesus arrived to make that clear. Those words form the backdrop to the process of nationhood that took place during the reign of their first and only 3 kings of a united nation. Further, their rejection of God's plan, as revealed through Jesus, has continued ever since their return to the Middle East in 1948, while an apostate church has groveled before them in further deference for what they did and what they continue to do to the only begotten Son of God, the world's one and only true Messiah. The history of just about every nation on earth includes narratives from their religious leaders assuring the masses that everything done by the nation's human leaders was the will of God. The nation of Israel is only an exception in that God managed to preserve records of him saying exactly the opposite of what the patriots said, right there in their own holy book. The task of building a house for the God of the Old Testament was left to a peaceful king, to David's son, Solomon. Solomon became famous for this temple, for his wealth, and for his wisdom. Solomon himself contributed several books to the Old Testament, the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and a somewhat strange book called the Song of Solomon. Yet Jesus Christ, found it necessary to pointedly single out Solomon's spiritual inferiority by comparing Solomon's wisdom to the far superior message that he himself had brought to the world. You can learn more about that and the link between Solomon and the Antichrist in yet another video that we have released on this channel called Jesus and the Mark of the Beast. There is a link to that video in the description below. Now, the kingdom of Israel divided after Solomon's death, and 10 of the 12 original tribes that made up the Hebrew children simply disappeared without a trace. All we have left today are the tribe of Judah, from which we get the word Jews, and part of the tribe of Benjamin. It remained for Jesus Christ, almost 1,000 years after the so-called Golden Age, to set up God's true kingdom, a kingdom which Jesus steadfastly refused to refer to as the kingdom of Israel. Tragically, it was the crippled, counterfeit, and cruel kingdom of Israel that tortured and killed the true Messiah, in their keeping with the similarly cruel image of their God in the Old Testament. This tragic rejection of Jesus Christ and all that he taught has spread to a large proportion of the so-called Christian church today. They stubbornly teach that the God of the kingdom of Israel is the one true God, while Jesus, the true Messiah, gets universally sidelined by Jews and professing Christians alike. It does appear that this falling away in Old Testament times may have included writing into their history books depictions of a David-like God, with the intention of convincing the world that such a God is the one true God. You must decide for yourself. As I have already said, the God of the New Testament is also harsh at times. He makes rules, and he insists on being the one who decides when it is time to learn new truth, real truth. He demands that we honor him above everyone else, including our own families, and that we listen to his Son, even to the point of being prepared to lay down our lives for him and for others in love. But he also asks us to believe that under it all, he loves us. What he says and does, as cruel and harsh as it may seem from some perspectives, is all part of a much bigger plan. Life and all the pleasures that are capable of filling that life stretch much further than anything we can experience in a few short years here on earth. If you can believe he loves you, I can testify from my own experience, you will begin to see his love everywhere you look, including places you never would have imagined to see love before. But if you cannot believe that he loves you, it will be left to you and any replacement God that you might find to do a better job than what he has done to bring happiness to his creation. That's it. I know it's a lot to take in, and I fully understand a lot of you having a difficult time even contemplating that the real God of the Old Testament may have actually been misrepresented by the people of the Old Testament. Please take time to discuss the points raised in this series of videos and their implications in your own private conversations with the one true God and with his dear Son, Jesus. Not with your church pastor, but with your Lord. Feel free to voice your comments below if you can do so without shouting, that is, by not using all caps, and in posts of 100 words or less, in order to allow room for calm and polite discussion. If you like what we are saying, please subscribe to this channel and do what you can to get others to do the same thing. Please watch more of our videos and add your comments to each of them as well, so that we can better determine how we are coming across to you, our viewers. Thank you for listening, and God bless you.